High above the Leary Valley, where winter winds knifed through shattered stone and the air forever smelled of cordite, there was a moment, just a moment, when the guns fell silent. A moment when Germans and Allies, locked in one of the most brutal and grinding battles of World War II, simply stopped. They stood from trenches, stepped out from behind blasted olive trees, and watched each other with the wary eyes of men who had forgotten what peace even looked like. And for a few surreal minutes, on the slopes of Monte Cassino, a truce, never planned, never signed, never acknowledged by any officer, took shape between enemies who had been slaughtering one another for months. It would vanish as quickly as it appeared. But those few minutes became one of the most haunting footnotes in the entire Italian campaign. This is the story of the bizarre, unsanctioned truce at Monte Cassino, and the human cost that forced even hardened soldiers to pause a war that neither side truly wished to fight. Monte Cassino, to the ancient Romans, it was a peaceful hilltop. To the Benedictine monks of the Abbey, it was a sanctuary of learning. To the German army in 1943–44, it became one of the most important natural fortresses in Italy. And to the Allied troops looking up at its steep, jagged slopes, it was hell. The terrain that dictated a campaign. The mountain stood just over 500 meters high. Not extraordinarily tall, but steep, rocky, and dominating the entire valley. Below it, Highway 6, the main road from southern Italy to Rome, snaked through the Leary Valley. Whoever controlled Monte Cassino controlled the road. And whoever controlled that road controlled entry to the Italian capital. It was the keystone of the Gustav Line, a network of defensive positions the German 10th Army had constructed after the fall of Naples. According to historical records, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring understood the value of terrain better than almost any other commander in the theater. He knew the Allies would be forced to come through Cassino, and he intended to make them pay for it. Town already dying. By January 1944, the once lively town of Cassino was reduced to rubble. Months of fighting had driven nearly every civilian away. Those who stayed lived in cellars, emerging only long enough to scavenge for food. The abbey above, one of the oldest monastic institutions in Western Europe, remained intact, but stood like a ghost on the skyline. Serene, ancient, and utterly out of place among the artillery flashes lighting the valley at night. Allied troops believed the abbey housed German artillery spotters. German commanders insisted it didn't. The truth, confirmed by post-war investigations. No German troops were stationed inside the abbey until after it was destroyed. The Allies, cold, exhausted, and facing the impossible. The soldiers arriving at Monte Cassino in early 1944 came from everywhere. Battle-hardened Americans from the 34th Infantry Division. British units worn down by months in Italy. Indian divisions whose mule columns struggled up icy paths. Gurkhas who could climb sheer rock faces with terrifying agility. New Zealanders under General Bernard Freyberg. French Moroccan Gummiers adept at mountain warfare. And later, Polish II Corps under General Władysław Anders. Men who had survived Soviet captivity only to find themselves fighting on a foreign mountain for a cause larger than themselves. Many had fought in North Africa. Many had never seen terrain like this. All we saw was rock, rubble, and death, recalled one American sergeant years later. Every step felt like we were walking into the jaws of a dragon. The Germans, outnumbered but dug in like stone. Facing them were experienced German paratroopers, the Fallschirmjäger, often regarded as among the most disciplined troops in the Wehrmacht. They were masters of defensive warfare, precise, patient, and deadly. Armed with MG-42 machine guns, mortars, and pre-registered artillery coordinates, they turned every ridge, every crevice, every blasted tree stump into a killing zone. One Fallschirmjäger veteran later said, "Cassino was not a battle. It was an avalanche of misery, but even they were stretched thin, cold, hungry, and rotated too slowly. They fought with the desperation of men who knew retreat was not an option." By the time the bizarre truce occurred, Monte Cassino had already consumed thousands of lives. For major battles would be waged there throughout early 1944, each more brutal than the last. Part 1 of this documentary focuses on the run-up to the truce, a period where the human breaking point loomed. The bombing of the Abbey. On February 15, 1944, American bombers, acting on Allied intelligence later proven incorrect, dropped 1,400 tons of bombs on the Abbey. To Allied observers in the valley, the spectacle looked like a volcano erupting. A massive plume rose thousands of feet into the sky as centuries of culture vanished in minutes. But the bombing changed nothing. The mountain remained a fortress. The Germans simply moved into the ruins, using the collapsed walls as natural bunkers. The tragedy was complete. The ground assaults. Each Allied attempt to break through was met with the same response. German artillery rained down from hidden positions. Machine guns snapped from impossible angles, and the steep slopes made every uphill movement a gamble with death. According to British accounts, even wounded men struggled to crawl back down the mountain, often under fire, often alone. By March, both sides were exhausted. Food was scarce, ammunition low. A New Zealand corporal wrote in his diary, "This mountain eats men alive. You don't attack it, you feed it." The specific truce we focus on occurred during one of these grueling phases. Most sources point to late March 1944, though exact dates differ across testimonies. What matters is the context. Both armies were at the edge of collapse, fighting among rubble where no one could even tell where the front line ended and began. The unexpected moment. The fighting that morning had been particularly savage. Mortars had pounded Allied slopes since dawn. Machine gun nests hidden in rocks kept every movement in check. German snipers watched every trail. But sometime late morning, perhaps around 11 a.m., based on multiple diaries, the firing simply stopped. No order, no plan, just a sudden, eerie silence rolling down the mountain. In the words of an Indian Army sepoy who survived Cassino, it was as though the mountain itself took a breath. What triggered it? Historians cannot point to a single definitive cause, but accounts tend to converge on one possibility. Wounded men lay between the lines, crying out for help. The slopes of Cassino made casualty retrieval nearly impossible. Bodies slid down rocks, got tangled in barbed wire, or lay exposed on narrow terraces. According to surviving German reports, even the Fallschirmjäger could hear Allied wounded calling for water. And on this day, something snapped. A German medic, white cloth tied to a stick, stepped out first. He was followed by others carrying stretchers. Across the no-man's land, Allied soldiers hesitated, rifles aimed, confused. But then they, too, stepped forward. The unspoken agreement. For several surreal minutes, both armies retrieved their wounded and dead. The Germans carried some Allied soldiers to the center of the field. In return, American and Indian medics helped German wounded. Some soldiers waved. Some stared in disbelief. Others looked away, unable to process what was happening. A New Zealand infantryman later wrote, "You could see their faces clearly, young, tired, filthy. They looked just like us." And that was the unbearable part. The enemy, seen up close, looked human again. Truces, formal or informal, did happen in warfare even in World War II. But Monte Cassino's stood out for several reasons. 1. The battle's unrelenting brutality. Cassino was a grinder. Few pauses occurred. Soldiers rarely saw the enemy except through scopes or fleeting shadows. A truce here was almost unimaginable. 2. The terrain made such a truce dangerous. The slopes were so exposed that any movement could be mistaken for an attack. Stepping out into the open required extraordinary trust on both sides. 3. The truce was entirely spontaneous. No commanders agreed to it. No messages were exchanged. No white flags prepared. It was born purely from human instinct. 4. It lasted only minutes. Most accounts place the duration at less than 10 minutes. 10 minutes of peace in months of slaughter. The heartbreaking detail in these accounts is how quickly the truce dissolved. In one diary, a Polish soldier wrote, "We lifted a body and then crack, a shot. Someone fired. No one knows who." Other versions say mortar fire resumed without warning. Some say a nervous sentry misread a movement. Some suggest an officer, horrified at the break in discipline, gave the order. Whatever the cause, the silence shattered. Suddenly, both sides dove back into cover. Medics sprinted for safety. The wounded left behind lay where they fell, just as before. The mountain returned to war. One Fallschirmjäger veteran said decades later, "It was as if God had blinked, and when he opened his eyes again, we were killing each other again." In the grand scheme of the war, this truce changed nothing strategically. But to the men who lived through it, it became an unforgettable symbol of the human soul trying to surface through the mud and blood. It showed that even in one of the most brutal battles of World War II, compassion could flicker briefly but unmistakably. High on the summit of Monte Cassino, in the ruins of what had once been one of Europe's most influential monastic communities, an elderly Benedictine monk stood among broken stones and looked down at the valley below. His name was Father Gregorio Diamar, the last abbot of the abbey. He had watched the world burn from a front row seat. The day of the bizarre truce, the abbey still lay in smoking ruins from the February bombardment. Its columns snapped like bones, its frescoes reduced to dust. Its manuscripts, those that could be saved, had been carried away by monks weeks earlier. Now, silence occasionally fell over the ruins. But the silence wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of exhaustion. The silence of armies pausing only because they could not fight another second. Father Gregorio had seen battles before. Italy's long history was full of them, but nothing matched what he saw unfolding below. Young men climbing into death, fighting inch by inch, stone by stone, for a place that held no strategic glamour, no glory, just necessity. He later said in a post-war interview, "The mountain itself cried," and in those few surreal minutes of truce, he watched something extraordinary. A break in the cascade of brutality. A moment where even hardened soldiers behaved like children pulling wounded brothers out of danger. It was a sight as fragile as it was impossible. But to understand why those minutes mattered, we must step back to the days surrounding the truce, when both armies neared their breaking point, and when commanders made decisions that would shape the next brutal phase of the battle. General Fridolin von Senger und Etterlin, the scholar defender. The German commander responsible for defending the Gustav Line around Cassino was an unusual figure for the Wehrmacht. General Fridolin von Senger und Etterlin was a devout Catholic, a Rhodes Scholar, and a man who had studied at Oxford. He had even visited the Monte Cassino Abbey before the war as a guest of the monks. He was horrified at the prospect of it being drawn into battle. According to post-war records, von Senger issued strict orders. No German soldier was to occupy the abbey. No guns were to be fired from within its walls. He hoped this would protect the historic site. Didn't. But what is less known is how torn he was about the fighting that unfolded beneath the abbey after the bombing. When he learned of the brief truce on the slopes, he later wrote, "It does not surprise me. My men were human. So were theirs." General Bernard Freyberg, a man under impossible orders. On the Allied side stood Lieutenant General Bernard Freyberg, commander of the New Zealand Corps. Freyberg was a legend, a World War I hero, a man with scars across his body, and someone trusted by Winston Churchill himself. But at Cassino, he faced an impossible task: break the Gustav Line, capture the town, open the road to Rome, and do it with units already bloodied and exhausted. Freyberg believed the abbey must fall. He believed the Germans were using it for observation. He pressed for its destruction. After the bombing, he still had to capture the mountain, now more fortified than ever. He had mixed feelings about the truce. Some accounts say he was angry at any pause that wasn't officially negotiated. Other sources suggest he never knew about it in real time. It was too small, too spontaneous, too quick to reach high command. In Cassino, even generals couldn't keep track of the chaos. General Anders and the Polish II Corps. Polish soldiers would not fully enter the battle until later, but their presence was already known. General Władysław Anders, a man who had spent years in Soviet captivity, commanded an army made of survivors. Men pulled from Siberian labor camps, reunited with families they thought dead, now fighting for a homeland they could not return to. Even before their arrival, Allied soldiers whispered, "The Poles will take Cassino if no one else can." But they, too, were human. Even they would write about exhaustion, fear, and moments where hatred of the enemy briefly dissolved into shared suffering. The most vivid traces of the bizarre truce do not come from official military records. They come from the diaries of ordinary soldiers. The American infantryman, an American private in the 34th Infantry Division, wrote in a small, mud-soaked notebook, "I saw a German medic dragging one of ours by the collar, like a little kid pulling a sled. I didn't shoot. None of us did. He waved us off as if to say, 'Not now.' And God help me, we listened." The German paratrooper, a Fallschirmjäger corporal, wrote, "We carried their wounded to them. We did not speak. We were too tired for words. The mountain was full of ghosts that day." The Indian sepoy, a sepoy in the 4th Indian Division, recalled in a later letter, "The mountain gave us permission to breathe. That's how it felt." Our officers asked later why things had gone quiet, but no one explained. How could we? The New Zealand sergeant. From a New Zealander's diary, one of the Jerrys lit a cigarette after we'd pulled the bodies back. He held it up like a toast. I think he meant it as respect, or surrender, or who knows. War makes everything hard to understand. These accounts differ in small details, but they all converge on the same emotional truth. Both sides needed the truce. Both sides were shocked by it. Both sides knew it couldn't last. To understand why tension snapped into a spontaneous ceasefire, we must look at what had been happening in the days, indeed the hours before it occurred. Terrain that murdered. Monte Cassino's slopes were not merely steep, they were designed by nature for defense. The Allies climbed terraces of rock while under. Sniper fire. Artillery pre-registered on every yard. Machine guns placed behind shattered boulders. Mines, both anti-tank and anti-personnel. Mortars that could reach anywhere. A British officer summarized, "Every approach was a death sentence. On some days, patrols were slaughtered before they even left their own lines. Casualties piling up between the lines. Bodies accumulated on ledges, in ravines, or hung on tangled wire. Some wounded men rolled down slopes and ended up in places neither side could safely reach. The cries for water at night were the most haunting. Soldiers on both sides wrote of feeling shaken, stricken, even ashamed listening to men they could not rescue. These cries created the emotional pressure for a break in fighting. Overlapping fields of fire. German positions and Allied positions were so close that the slightest movement could trigger an entire hillside's worth of fire. That proximity made the truce even more remarkable. A German medic stepping forward was gambling his life on the hope that the exhausted men facing him were done shooting. 1. A lull in firing, possibly due to ammunition shortages. Both sides had been active since dawn. Mortars often ran dry before noon. Machine gunners had to conserve belts. A sudden lull was not rare, but silence this deep was rare. 2. Medics acted first. Multiple accounts mention medics waving cloth or hands, climbing toward the wounded. In at least 2 diaries, German medics came first. In another, it was Allied stretcher bearers. In truth, it may have happened in 2 places at once. 3. Soldiers signaled to hold fire. Accounts describe gestures, palms open, helmets raised, stretchers hoisted upright, shouts in broken English or German. No one used whistles or flares. No one radioed HQ. This was bottom-up humanity. 4. The dead were claimed, the wounded carried off. Men shuffled down slopes with bodies slung over shoulders. Some offered cigarettes. Some nodded. Some cried openly. One German veteran recalled decades later, "I carried a man who whispered Danke. He wasn't German." 5. Someone fired. No one knows who. A sniper unaware of the truce? A frightened sentry? A rookie soldier seeing movement? Or simply the return of scheduled artillery? There is no conclusive record, but the result was immediate. 6. The mountain erupted back into war. Machine guns barked. Mortars thumped. Both sides scurried to cover. Dead men were left where the firing resumed. A British medic wrote, "It ended as suddenly as it started. Like a door slammed shut. Why does this tiny truce endure in historical memory? Because it exposed something raw, something deeply human. Even in total war, compassion survived, barely, but undeniably. But the return to violence was emotionally crushing for many soldiers. The psychological whiplash. Some Allied troops wrote that they felt worse after the truce than before. Seeing the enemy up close had made killing them harder. A New Zealander said, "I had looked into the eyes of a German my age. When the guns started again, I felt sick." We all did. German soldiers felt similarly. Fallschirmjäger units later described Monte Cassino as psychologically damaging in a way few other battles were. Officers react. Oddly, there is little evidence that high command on either side investigated or even acknowledged the truce. It was too small, too local, too short. One British colonel reportedly said afterward, "If it happened, but don't let it happen again." War allowed little room for unofficial mercy, a moment that could not last. The tragedy of the truce is that it might have been repeated, had the battle been less savage, had the terrain been less punishing, had officers been more flexible, had exhaustion not turned to paranoia. But Cassino was a place where the margin between life and death was measured in inches. The truce was a spark of humanity trying to ignite in a hurricane. It had no chance. As Part 2 concludes, we arrive at a turning point. The strange truce was over. Both sides would now brace themselves for one of the final and most decisive phases of the battle. The arrival of troops who would ultimately change the fate of Monte Cassino. Up next, the entry of Polish II Corps, their impossible mission, the storming of the Abbey grounds, and the end of the battle that scarred a generation. But before we ascend again into fire, we leave this part with the image of a few minutes when the mountainside, men remembered their humanity, and war, briefly, forgot itself. In mid-1944, weeks after the bizarre truce that flickered and died on the slopes of Monte Cassino, a new force arrived in the valley. They marched with quiet discipline. They wore worn boots and carried rifles older than many of their youngest soldiers. Their banners bore the white eagle of a nation that no longer existed on any map. They were the Polish II Corps, commanded by General Władysław Anders, an army made of the displaced, the scarred, the exiled. To the outside world, they were elite mountain fighters assigned to break the most stubborn German position in Italy. But to themselves, they were fighting for something far heavier, the right to exist, past written in captivity. To understand their role at Monte Cassino, one must understand who they were. Most soldiers of the Polish II Corps had been imprisoned in Soviet labor camps after the 1939 invasion of Poland. When Germany later turned on the Soviet Union in 1941, a political agreement between Stalin and the Polish government in exile allowed Polish prisoners to be released. Thousands, skeletal, diseased, starving, stumbled out of gulags and onto dusty mustering grounds in Central Asia. From these hollowed men and their families, Anders rebuilt an army. They trained in Persia. They marched through Iraq. They drilled in Palestine. They fought in Italy. Every step they took from Siberia to Italy was a restoration of identity. A Polish veteran recalled, "We had no country to return to, so we said, if we die, let it be for something worth dying for." Why they were sent to Cassino. By early 1944, Allied attempts to seize Monte Cassino had failed 3 times. The mountain remained a fortress. German Fallschirmjäger held every wall, every stone, every scrap of ground. The Abbey ruins had become a honeycomb of fortified positions. General Anders and his Poles were given one mission: take Monte Cassino whatever the cost. It was a task so overwhelming that Allied officers quietly debated whether it was even possible. But Anders accepted, not out of confidence, out of necessity. He knew this was the moment for Poles to prove themselves to the world. One of his staff officers wrote, "We saw Cassino not as a mountain. We saw it as a gate. Behind it lay the recognition of Poland's sacrifice." First impressions. When the Polish II Corps first looked up at Monte Cassino, many went silent. They had marched thousands of kilometers, but none had seen terrain like this. A Polish NCO recorded in his journal, "It looked like the mouth of a furnace. The ground was torn by artillery. Every hillside was cratered. Every ravine held bodies, some days old, some months old. The abbey ruins loomed above like a broken crown. German defenders observing from above. The Fallschirmjäger, now legends in their own right, watched the new arrivals through binoculars. Some German accounts describe a strange respect for Anders' army. They saw men wearing mismatched uniforms, marching with fierce discipline, carrying themselves with an air of grim determination. One German paratrooper reportedly said, "These men were not normal reinforcements. They walked like ghosts who wanted revenge." But what both sides understood was this: the battle was entering its final phase. The mountain was nearly out of blood to drink. Something had to give. Before the Poles moved, the Allies launched Operation Diadem, a massive coordinated offensive aimed at breaking the Gustav Line across its entire length. The idea was simple. The French Expeditionary Corps would attack through the mountains on the western flank. The British and Americans would strike along the Liri Valley, and the Poles would take Monte Cassino itself. If all three sectors advanced, the Germans would be forced to collapse backward, abandoning their stony citadel above Cassino. Polish reconnaissance. Facing the impossible. Polish reconnaissance patrols crept forward at night. They reported minefields layered 3 deep, machine gun nests built into natural caves, snipers hidden among rubble, razor wire draped across narrow terraces, Fallschirmjäger positions overlapping perfectly. One officer wrote, "Every stone was an enemy position. Every bush had eyes." Even Anders privately questioned whether his exhausted, undersupplied army could take the mountain. But he gave the order. At 11 p.m., the valley ignited. The night of thunder. Over 1,600 Allied guns opened fire in unison. The bombardment rolled like a thunderstorm up the side of Monte Cassino. The night sky glowed orange. The abbey ruins flickered like a lantern on a stormy sea. Polish soldiers crouched in trenches, gripping rifles, listening to the constant thunder that shook the earth. They knew they were about to climb into hell. A Polish private whispered a prayer, later recorded, "God, I have seen Siberia. I have seen starvation. Let me not fail my country now." The ascent begins. At 1 a.m., Polish infantry advanced. They moved uphill, illuminated by burning brush and artillery flashes. German machine guns quickly came to life. Mortars crashed down. Mines tore men apart. It was dark, chaotic, and deadly. On one slope, called Phantom Ridge by Allied troops, entire platoons were shredded before moving 50 meters. German defenders had spent months studying the terrain. Every route was a trap. A British liaison officer watching from below said, "It was like watching men climb into the mouth of a dragon." Despite being outnumbered, the German paratroopers fought with brutal efficiency. Their morale was astonishingly high despite months of attrition. They were defending sacred ground, not the abbey, but the principle that the Gustav Line must not break. The art of the defensive fight. The Fallschirmjäger were experts in counterattacks, small unit tactics, concealed fire positions, sniper coordination, use of natural cover. They let Polish units climb exposed ground, then hammered them from above. They pinned assault groups against boulders, forcing them to flatten themselves against the earth to avoid sniper fire. Some German snipers later recalled seeing Polish soldiers crawling over bodies from previous assaults. One paratrooper wrote, "The Poles kept coming. We admired them. We feared them. The battle becomes personal." For the Poles, this was not just another assault. Many shouted the names of towns or villages in Poland before charging forward. Some carried small scraps of fabric taken from family homes. Many wore rosaries around their necks. Others tucked them into helmets. This was less a military operation than a final test of existence. The initial assault failed. Hundreds were dead or wounded, but Anders did not retreat, regrouping under fire. Polish commanders crawled from foxhole to foxhole under sniper fire, reorganizing shattered companies. Some units had lost half their men. Logistics broke down. Communications were patchy. Yet the men prepared to climb again. A battalion commander said simply, "We fight until the mountain belongs to us." A change in tactics. Instead of broad front attacks, Anders shifted to narrow, concentrated thrusts aimed at key German strongpoints. Point 593. Call San Angelo. The switch line, point 593, dominating the approach to the Abbey, proved the most deadly. Multiple assaults failed. German paratroopers, entrenched in deep bunkers, repelled every wave. A Polish lieutenant noted, "The Germans fought like lions. We fought like men with nothing left to lose." By the evening of May 12th, casualty clearing stations overflowed. The wounded lay in rows on stretchers. Priests moved quietly through makeshift wards, whispering comforts. Letters never delivered. Many Poles wrote final letters that night. Most would never be delivered. One soldier wrote to his wife, "If I fall, know that I did not fear death. I feared only not seeing Poland free again." Another wrote, "Tell our son I climbed as high as I could." The Germans' own losses. German medics reported severe exhaustion. The Fallschirmjäger were beginning to crack under the relentless pressure. They had repelled multiple assaults, but each counterattack cost them irreplaceable men. One German medic later recalled, "They kept coming, even when we believed none could be left alive. It wore us down more than the bombs." On May 13th, heavy fog rolled across the mountain. Visibility dropped. Snipers on both sides struggled to see. Mortars became less accurate. For the Poles, this was a blessing. For the German machine gunners, it was a curse. The fog of opportunity. Polish patrols used the fog to infiltrate ravines and outflank German positions. They discovered weaknesses, slipped behind lines, and began capturing prisoners. German accounts mention sudden silence in positions that had been manned minutes earlier. A Polish officer wrote, "The mountain gave us a chance. That chance would lead directly to the breakthrough." Late on May 17th, after days of brutal assaults, the German command, facing collapse across the Gustav Line, authorized a withdrawal from the Abbey Heights. The Fallschirmjäger executed the retreat with remarkable discipline, slipping away along hidden mule trails. They left behind only small rearguard forces. The Poles, unaware at first, prepared for yet another day of slaughter. But on the morning of May 18th, 1944, a patrol from the Polish 12th Podolian Ulan crept toward the crest. Expecting machine gun fire, they found silence. Only the wind moved through the ruins. At 10:20 a.m., a young Polish soldier climbed onto the shattered wall of the Abbey ruins and raised a makeshift flag, white and red, patched together from scraps of cloth by medics the night before. It fluttered weakly in the mountain breeze. A Polish officer wrote, "We cried openly, not from victory, from release." German survivors watched from the next ridge and later wrote that they felt relief, not defeat. They had done all they could. But for the Poles, this was a moment carved into history. They had taken the mountain. They had broken the Gustav Line. They had reclaimed a part of their dignity. When the guns finally stopped echoing across the Liri Valley on May 18th, 1944, Monte Cassino was no longer a mountain. It was a graveyard of soldiers, a graveyard of nations, a graveyard of ideas. The Abbey, the cradle of Western monasticism, was a ruin of broken columns and pulverized marble. The slopes that had consumed for Allied attempts were littered with craters, rusted helmets, snapped rifles, medical kits, burned-out tanks, and thousands of unmarked graves. And yet, among this devastation, a strange quiet settled over the valley. Not the tense, unnatural silence of the bizarre truce weeks earlier, but the silence that follows exhaustion, victory, and unbearable loss. A Polish chaplain wrote, "The valley was finally quiet, yet the quiet was heavier than the artillery. Even the birds avoided the mountain for days. It was as if the land itself was in mourning. An Allied victory bought in blood. The capture of Monte Cassino opened the road to Rome. Within 2 weeks, Allied forces entered the capital. Churchill would later call the battle one of the most heroic feats of arms in the war. But the numbers behind that praise were staggering. More than 50,000 Allied casualties across 4 battles. Thousands killed in the Polish II Corps alone. Entire companies wiped out in hours. dozens of units reduced to half-strength or worse. The French Moroccan Gumiers, the British, the Indians, the New Zealanders, the Americans, all left pieces of themselves on that mountain. For the Poles, the price was especially heartbreaking. For many, the Abbey ruins were the closest thing they would ever again have to a homeland. A Polish veteran later said, "We buried our brothers in a foreign soil because Poland had no soil left for us." German losses. The last stand of the Fallschirmjäger. The German paratroopers paid heavily too. They fought with unmatched skill, but they were gradually bled dry. Records show entire platoons dwindled to a dozen men. Officers died in trenches. Medics collapsed beside their patients. One German survivor recalled, "Cassino was not defeat. Cassino was sacrifice." They withdrew with discipline, but also with a sense of profound fatigue. The mountain had consumed them too. Victory without a home. The most tragic chapter of Monte Cassino came not on the battlefield, but afterward. Polish soldiers, who had fought harder than anyone expected, who had climbed the steepest slopes and raised their flag over the ruins, were soon confronted with a shocking truth. Their homeland would not be restored. While they fought in Italy, political agreements in Tehran and later Yalta sealed the post-war division of Europe. Poland would fall under Soviet influence. Many soldiers had no homes to return to. Families remained behind the Iron Curtain. A veteran remembered, "We took the stronghold of Europe, and yet we lost our country." Exile, not triumph. After the war, many Polish veterans settled in Britain, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. Others lived quietly in exile across the world. A few who attempted to return to Poland were imprisoned by the new regime. The victory at Cassino became a symbol of their sacrifice, and the bitter irony of their fate. Every year, at the Polish War Cemetery on the slopes below the Abbey, visitors see the inscription, "For our freedom and yours." The graves stretch in perfect rows, each marked with the Polish eagle. Each stone whispers a story of exile. For the German paratroopers, the Battle of Monte Cassino became a defining moment in their military legacy. Even Allied commanders acknowledged the professionalism and tenacity of the defenders. One British officer said, "We fought lions on that mountain." The Fallschirmjäger, despite eventual retreat, emerged with a reputation for being among the most disciplined defensive formations of the entire war. After the surrender of Germany in 1945, many of these veterans returned to ruined homes. Some never fully recovered from the trauma of the battle. Diaries reveal nightmares, guilt, and recurring memories of the fleeting truce. One wrote late in life, "I still see the man I carried down the slope. I do not know his name. I hope he lived." The loss of a millennium. The bombing of the Abbey remains one of the most controversial actions of the Italian campaign. Though the Allies believed the Germans were using it, post-war investigation confirmed they had not placed troops inside. The destruction of the Abbey, founded by Saint Benedict in the 6th century, was a cultural catastrophe. Father Gregorio Diamar, the abbot who watched the bombing in horror, said, "I felt as if the world itself were ending." Reconstruction. After the war, with aid from Italy and international donors, the abbey was painstakingly rebuilt. Every stone was catalogued, photographed, and restored. Frescoes were recreated. Manuscripts preserved by the monks during evacuation were returned. By 1964, the abbey reopened. Today it stands not only as a religious monument, but as a testament to resilience, the same resilience shown by the soldiers who bled on its slopes. The bizarre truce at Monte Cassino remains one of the most haunting small moments in World War II. But why? Why do historians, veterans, and families talk about those few minutes of silence more intensely than hours of fighting? 1. Because it revealed the humanity buried under war. In just a few minutes, enemies who had spent months trying to kill each other saw one another as men, not uniforms. A New Zealander who survived the battle said later, "We didn't cease fire because we liked each other. We ceased fire because we remembered we were the same." 2. Because it happened without orders. No generals negotiated it. No officers planned it. No documents recorded it. It happened because ordinary soldiers, tired, frozen, hungry, chose mercy over violence. 3. Because it ended as quickly as it began. The gunfire that returned after those minutes felt, to many, like a betrayal of something fragile. A reminder that war does not allow humanity to linger. A German medic described it perfectly. The truce was like a candle in a storm. It flickered, and the wind took it. 4. Because it symbolized everything Monte Cassino stood for. The brutality, the futility, the heroism, the sorrow, the strange, persistent thread of humanity, all condensed into a moment no longer than a prayer, a victory without triumph. Despite the strategic success, Monte Cassino never became a symbol of glory. It became a symbol of endurance, sacrifice, and the tragic cost of war. It showed that soldiers can display incredible bravery and unshakable resolve, yet still be powerless against the decisions of nations. A battle remembered in many languages. Today, visitors to Monte Cassino hear stories from every front. Americans describing the mud and mortar fire, Gurkhas recounting night assaults with kukris, German veterans speaking of hidden bunkers and cold hunger, Poles reading poetry written in trenches, Indians, French, Moroccans, New Zealanders, each with their own tragedy. The mountain remembers them all. The silence remains. Walk the slopes today and you may still feel it. That sudden, impossible silence. That fleeting truce. That moment when the battle paused. And soldiers on both sides remembered. They were human. As the camera pans across the rebuilt abbey, sunlight catching its white walls, an old narration rises. Slow, steady, reflective. War is not only measured in victories and defeats, it is measured in choices. On Monte Cassino, where the world seemed to end, men made a choice to stop killing if only for minutes. And in that small moment, forgotten by commanders but remembered by those who were there, humanity flickered like a match struck in a storm. Fade to black. Credits roll over the Polish war cemetery. Then the German cemetery. Then the abbey standing quiet once more.